Hello, everybody. Today's episode is on hard bop. So, in pretty rapid succession now, we have gone, we spent all this time on sort of like Dixieland and swing, and there's quite a bit of that. And now, in very rapid succession, we've gone bang, 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 bang through a lot of different styles. We went from bebop to cool to third stream to modal, now hard bop. There was a little bit of fusion in there, and we'll circle back with that as well. So these are just more of the evolving styles, and they all happen chronologically pretty close together. Cool, the big cool breakthrough is Birth of the Cool in 1949, and cool jazz continues to be relatively popular well into the 60s. The Getz Gilberto album with Girl from Ipanema, for example, that was like 1963. It actually charted on the pop charts. So that will continue. Cool jazz continues. The third stream things were the late 50s, early 60s. Modal jazz will be a thing for a while. Obviously, the Kind of Blue album, the greatest selling jazz record in history. But John Coltrane goes off and does sort of a modal album with a tune called Impressions and things like that. And other people continue to work along those lines. And hard bop was developed around the 50s, kind of to coincide with the civil rights era, and this will continue as well. So all this stuff is kind of going on at the same time, just new sort of innovative things, okay? So today's topic being hard bop, this is the music that is most closely sort of associated with black jazz musicians in the 50s and the 60s. Again, it sort of coincides with civil rights. You could, on the pop music side of things, you could see the companion being the rise of soul music, sort of being the voice of African Americans, and kind of not necessarily expressing their the goings on of sort of the civil rights era, but sort of being the soundtrack to that era for them. In jazz, it's hard bop, and sometimes in jazz, it's the statements are much more emphatic and in your face, and you're going to see some of that here. Okay, so this is very much sort of an urban, soulful black type of jazz. In fact, as a lot of whites were leaving urban areas, moving out to suburbs, a lot of African Americans stayed in the more urban areas, and so you get less diversity actually in some of these urban areas, and a lot of African Americans. And this is the music of these jazz musicians from that time, in these big cities: Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, so on. Okay, I have a reaction against cool jazz ? Really. So cool jazz, again, started by Gil Evans and Miles Davis. Gil Evans was white, Miles Davis was black. It really didn't matter necessarily, but the music did become very white. Now, bebop was primarily black, and it was very innovative, and it was challenging, and it was the hippest thing, right? But it lost a lot of fans because it was so challenging. Cool jazz comes in, kind of swoops in, and takes many steps back from bebop and says, hey, relax, we don't need to be this complicated, mellow out, right? And that music became pretty popular, but it is predominantly white. So here you have a lot of white musicians capitalizing on jazz, a particular type of watered down, mellowed out, relaxed, cool jazz, West Coast cool. Okay. Hard bop is in many ways the pendulum going back and fighting against that. So if you guys are going to play that watered down junk, we're going to take jazz in a direction that is just so, for lack of a better term, so black that a white musician can't play it, because it would look ridiculous. It's going to have a certain sort of groove. It's just going to be very urban and very soulful and very black, that a white artist would have trouble doing it. There are other times this happens in history. We'll talk about those a little bit later. here. But obviously, it doesn't matter the color of a musician's skin. A good musician can play anything, but there's a a style, an attitude in a sense that if it's played by somebody that doesn't seem like they would understand where this music is coming from, it's less genuine, and that's kind of what we're talking about, at least early on here with hard bop. Okay, hard bop, even though they're both bop, hard bop is different from bebop or just from bop. If you just hear the term bop, they generally mean bebop. Hard bop is different from bop in the following ways. And none of these are tried and true, but this will give you an idea. The melodic the lines that they improvise are a little easier to follow. They are more blues based instead of being so complex that bebop can be. It's not Charlie Parker or Dizzy Gillespie's harmonic complexities. It's simpler. It's still very virtuosic and oftentimes very fast, but it is easier to follow. The accompaniment patterns are there's more variety in them. You'll hear that in the Blues March that I will upload, or a handful of other tunes. They're not just playing, they're not just accompanying the horns and just supporting them most of the time. They are more active participants in doing different things to create different accompaniments, to create different grooves, to do that kind of stuff. Okay, they play fewer pop tunes. Bebop musicians, and like the musicians before them, played a lot of pop tunes, and they would make them more complicated or whatever, but they would still play a lot of pop songs. Hard bop doesn't do that much. They write new music, again, oftentimes very heavily blues based. They write new tunes that are very groovy, very soulful, and they play those. They don't play George Gershwin or Irving Berlin pop songs, okay? And it swings. It is just really, really groovy, hard swinging music. I really like this stuff. This is kind of my favorite small group stuff, hard bop from the 50s and 60s. Okay. There was a subcategory of hard bop known as funky jazz. We're not going to split the difference, but just so you know that it's out there. And again, that just sort of reiterates the ethnic nature of this. It's the blackness of it. White musicians in the 50s aren't funky. Black musicians are, right? And again, painting with some stereotypes here, very broad brushes. All right. The video clip you're going to see about hard bop, they're going to introduce some of these people to you, and they're going to kind of create this narrative that's really nice. So I'm just going to let that run its course. I'm just going to reinforce some of that here. So some of the musicians, some of the many, many musicians that are well known for hard bop would be the Jazz Messengers, particularly the piano player Horace Silver, who left the Jazz Messengers and started doing his own stuff, still very much sort of gospel, soulful, funky hard bop, and Art Blakey, who's the drummer, and he continued to lead the Jazz Messengers for 30 years. The Jazz Messengers was started by Horace Silver and Art Blakey, and they would bring in horn players, and they would sort of teach these guys how to do it right. And then once they got to a certain level, they'd push them out and replace them with new young people. It was kind of like a training ground for great musicians, known for helping the careers of lots of young players. These guys are arguably the most representative of the funky jazz side of hard bop. A lot of their music is very soulful. And they have tunes like Grits and Gravy and stuff like that, Cornbread, and just a lot of soul food, soul music sorts of things. It's really great stuff. I'm going to upload a couple of tunes for you from this genre. I think I'll give you a tune by Horace Silver called The Preacher, and I'll put up the Blues March, which is Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. And there's dozens of great Jazz Messengers records. If you like this stuff, by all means, check them out. Typically great playing, really fun stuff. But this is a really good example of hard bop. Okay. Another great instrumentalist in hard bop would be Clifford Brown. He was a trumpet player who was kind of like a bluesy Dizzy Gillespie in a sense. Also very virtuosic, very fast, very amazing playing. But again, more of a hard bop blues oriented player instead of the the more complex player that Dizzy Gillespie was. Unfortunately, Clifford Brown died in a car accident fairly young, so there isn't a tremendous amount of recordings to remember him by. It would have been alternative history. Would have been amazing to see what Clifford Brown would have done or would have kept doing. Played very much like Dizzy Gillespie, very smooth, very fast excursions up into the high registers and louds and softs and all that kind of stuff. Generally had a more huskier tone than Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis. That's another characteristic of hard bop, is the sounds are heavy. Instead of being more agile, they have more sort of meat to them in a sense. Brown was able to stay clean during these years, which was very challenging for a lot of jazz musicians, but it kind of proved to a lot of people that you can play this great music and still be clean. You don't need to live like Charlie Parker to do it, right? He was a member of the Max Roach and Clifford Brown Quintet. I'm going to give you a tune called Take the A Train, which is actually a Duke Ellington, Billy Strayhorn tune. But I'm going to give you the version by Max Roach and Clifford Brown. They kind of make some train sounds, and that's a good example of the instrumental accompaniment varied patterns as well. Okay, so by all means, check out some Clifford Brown. All right, just a handful of others. Cannonball Adderley. He was the alto saxophone player that joined Miles Davis's first quintet to make it a sextet and appeared on that Kind of Blue record. He was actually a high school band director in Florida. This is a great story. He was in the military, and then he got out, and he was a high school band director. He went to New York. His brother, Nat Adderley, is a trumpet player. Went to New York, went to a club, brought his horn because he didn't want to leave it in the hotel or something. And the club, one of the band leaders said, "Hey man, my saxophone player is not here, but this other guy can play. Can he use your horn?" And Cannonball said, "No, but I'll play for you." And they're thinking, haha, this guy thinks he can walk onto a stage in New York and play. Well, so they started to try to play all this really hard music, and they'd call these tunes that are really hard. And Cannonball Adderley killed. He just slayed them all. And so overnight, he went back to Florida, but like overnight, he was called back up to come to New York. He became like famous immediately. It was really funny. I guess I wasn't there. He was the leading alto player of hard bop. Again, a huskier sound than like a Charlie Parker, definitely more than Paul Desmond. These are all alto saxophone players. Cannonball Adderley, Paul Desmond, Charlie Parker. If you compare and contrast their sounds, Paul Desmond on the cool stuff of the Dave Brubeck quartet, for example. Charlie Parker of his own stuff. The Parker recordings are older, so they don't sound as clear, so it's a little harder to compare. But listen to Cannonball Adderley play and listen to Paul Desmond play. It's night and day, just absolutely night and day. Even though it's the same horn, it's amazing. And then on the tenor sax side, John Coltrane did a lot of hard bop, but so did Sonny Rollins. Again, started a group played with Clifford Brown a lot, played with Miles Davis a lot, started to do a lot of his own things. Of all the people we've talked about, Sonny Rollins actually had the longest career and kept on going. You'll see a clip about Sonny Rollins as well. Okay? All right. One more really influential hard bop musician. That's the bass player and composer Charles Mingus. Mingus, as a member of the rhythm section, cut his teeth with all of these great young players. He actually was from Yuma, Arizona. And so he was in LA when Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie were in LA. So he kind of learned from those guys way back when. And then he moved to New York and he started working with all these others, with Charlie Parker, with Max Roach, the drummer, with Miles Davis. He himself wrote a tremendous amount of music, just like Thelonious Monk and Duke Ellington. I think Charles Mingus might be third in line, kind of. Maybe Wayne Shorter's in there too, but just a very prolific composer. Wrote a lot of music that became sort of standard jazz tunes. He actually had his own band that was not quite a big band, but similar. There's actually a legacy band that was put together by his wife, Sue Mingus, because Charles Mingus actually passed away from ALS in the, I want to say early 80s, like 81 maybe. So they put together a big band that actually plays in New York. They have a regular gig in New York. It's all these studio musicians who get together one night a week and play Mingus big band tunes. And they have made tons of records that are actually pretty popular among jazz circles, right? He would put a lot of different types of music in his compositions. There's folk music, there's third stream stuff, there's blues, there's gospel, there's all kinds of stuff. Very funky, very gospel-y, very groovy, oftentimes very soulful music. Some of it is very, very complicated as well. And almost more than the rest of these folks, and this is my transition here into our sort of civil rights stuff, Charles Mingus tackled some pretty serious issues that were going on in the late 50s and the early 60s. Keep in mind that the final big pieces of civil rights legislation for the African American community were passed in 1964, I think, 63 or 64, signed by President Johnson, desegregating things permanently. By that point, the Supreme Court, again, Plessy versus Ferguson, had been overruled in Brown versus Board of Education. We talked about that with Louis Armstrong, and Governor Faubus tried to keep the Little Rock Nine out of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, all that kind of stuff, right? So there's some really high-profile things here that eventually the musicians started to speak out more about publicly as well as musically. Sonny Rollins, for example, wrote what is considered the first purely instrumental racial protest, and that was a suite of music called the Freedom Suite in 1958. Max Roach, who was very outspoken about civil rights issues, actually recorded his group recorded an album called the Freedom Now Suite, which wasn't released on a major label because I'm actually going to give you the song Protest and you'll understand why. His wife at the time, Abby Lincoln, is screaming and shouting and all that kind of stuff. Coleman Hawkins also plays on the album, although not on the song Protest. Coleman Hawkins goes all the way back to you saw a short clip on Coleman Hawkins doing Body and Soul, and he goes all the way back to the Fletcher Henderson days. A major label would not touch this record, but the record label Candid did. Candid Records was created specifically to kind of release some of these more hot button issues. Okay, the critic Nat Hentoff, who actually founded Candid Records, called it, quote, a scathing criticism of the social conditions for blacks in the United States and Africa. There's a song called Johannesburg on this record as well, South Africa, and this was during the time of where obviously very ethnic tensions were happening in that country as well. So, okay. And then Charles Mingus' tune, Original Faubus Fables. There were two versions of this song that were released. One was called Fables of Faubus, which was the commercial release on his major record label, on the major label, and that's an instrumental version. The original Faubus Fables actually has words, and these are about Governor Faubus. So Governor Faubus, Orville Faubus, was the governor of Arkansas, tried to keep the Little Rock Nine out of Little Rock High School, right? This is the person that Louis Armstrong called a no good motherfucker, right? In his article with that North Dakota newspaper, the Grand Forks Herald, if I'm not mistaken, right? So Charles Mingus chimed in with this. The major record label would not release the original, so that one was released on Candid Records, but they did release the instrumental version, and I'm going to actually post both of them to you. You can check them both out, okay? So this is the kind of stuff that's happening at this time, and the musicians are expressing themselves, and they obviously have every right to. Here's, again, the Little Rock Nine photos, some of which have become pretty famous, all right? I'm also going to share with you a couple of other selections from this era that were written in response to some well-known tragedies of this time. You have to understand, if you're into politics, or if you follow politics at all, or you sort of understand the current red state to blue state situation in the country, The former Confederate states, the South, the Deep South, is red. It's very much solidified territory. But believe it or not, that used to be blue. It used to be Democratic territory. It used to be a certain type of Democrat known as Dixiecrats. And Dixiecrats they had a lot of democratic principles, but they were also pro-segregation. And so when Northern Democrats, particularly John F. Kennedy, before he was assassinated, started pushing for civil rights things. And after he was assassinated, obviously President Lyndon Johnson took over. Johnson was from Texas, but he also took over the whole civil rights cause. When he signed the last pieces of civil rights legislation, he famously said something to the effect of, "We have lost the South for a generation." And that's exactly what happened. All of those segregationalist Democrats became Republicans. They left the Democratic Party and they became Republicans, and they have since been that way for many years. And so you get you get the political implications of this sort of stuff. There was a lot of resistance to the civil rights legislation. There were bombings. There were murders. There's these things called freedom riders. They're people, white and black, that rode buses that were supposed to be segregated, like the bus stations were segregated, and the buses themselves, and they refused to follow those rules, and they were very violent protests. There were, of course, the sit-ins at lunch top counters at like Woolworths stores, where typically black college students would show up, and where they were not they were not allowed to be served, and they would sit at the lunch counter, and they would not cause, they were trained in nonviolent protests, and they would not fight, but they would not leave. And this obviously made people very uncomfortable, and oftentimes led to some very violent sort of encounters. Okay. So here are a couple of songs that I want you to listen to. And actually, there's going to be an assignment outside of the film worksheets that I want you to do a little bit of research about these events, listen to the songs, and then reflect on them a little bit, and then obviously send me your thoughts. One of them is original Faubus Fables, and these are the other two. One was a song by the tenor saxophone player John Coltrane called Alabama. It was composed and recorded in response to the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. This is where Klan members placed dynamite under some stairs or something of the 16th Street Baptist Church, and 4 young black girls were killed. It took a very long time for any of those men to see justice. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, many of them did not at all. And then another song by the jazz singer, Nina Simone, called Mississippi Goddamn, which she wrote in response to the murder of Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was an African-American civil rights worker. He was trying to register people to vote, black folks to vote, and he was followed home and shot in his front lawn, basically. So this is in response to that, as well as the 16th Street Baptist Church. That's Alabama, not Mississippi, but it's the same sort of thing. So listen to those 3 songs. I'll post the obviously I'm going to be posting the assignment. Check them out. Listen to the songs, reflect on them a little bit, do a little research, Google these things, and then just tell me how you feel about them. That's kind of what I want you to do with that. Okay. All right. So some of this landmark civil rights legislation and events. So Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. That desegregated schools. And the quote that the Supreme Court said that they must be desegregated with, quote, with all deliberate speed. Obviously, it took some places a lot longer, like Arkansas and Faubus and Mississippi, the University of Mississippi, and things like that. 1957 is when you finally got Little Rock High School desegregated. The bus boycotts, which was led by Martin Luther King, was from 55 to 57, and they realized that A lot of white folks had their own transportation. It was African Americans that used public transport the most. So if they went on a bus boycott, it would hurt public transportation. It took a long time, but the desired result eventually did happen. The Freedom Riders I discussed just briefly. Again, the desegregation of interstate travel, 1961. 1962, a black student by the name of James Meredith enrolled at the University of Mississippi. One black student. And President Kennedy had to send 5,000 National Guard troops to get that kid into that school. There were 2 deaths and hundreds of injuries. In 1963, Governor George Wallace, who later ran for president on the segregationist ticket. This is something that a lot of people, younger people, don't realize. It was before my time, but we're only talking 70 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, that there was a segregationalist party running for president. So there was Democrats, Republicans, and a segregationalist party. George Wallace was one of those. He attempted to stop the desegregation of the University of Alabama. Medgar Evers, like I said, was murdered in 1963. There was the March on Washington. That's when the Birmingham church bombing happened. So lots of things going on. Malcolm X was killed in 1965, and Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. So this is the time frame that a lot of these black musicians are negotiating life, basically, in their work. And that leads to something known as reverse racism. During the 60s, particularly the early 60s, many African-American musicians were accused of reverse racism. Miles Davis was one of these people because he would hire white musicians. And this would cause a problem within some in the black community. Why would you take musicians away? Why would you take jobs away from talented black musicians by hiring white musicians? This is a quote from Max Roach in a publication called Muhammad Speaks to, Muhammad Speaks to number 6 from December of 1962. How can those who charge Crow Jim, which is reverse racism, explain instead of Jim Crow, if you didn't get that, explain the very healthy living and fame gained through jazz by Dave Brubeck, Stan Kenton, Jerry Mulligan, Sherry Mann, Stan Getz, etc., etc. All these are white musicians. And as you now hopefully understand, jazz was an African-American musical creation, and most of the innovations happen through black musicians. Bebop, for example. Cool was started in part by Miles Davis. Modal jazz, Miles Davis. So again, you have in this case Max Roach saying these white musicians. He's not criticizing their talent or anything, but he's saying they are basically profiting off of the hard work of the African American musicians that came before them or were working at the same time of them. How can they explain that so few Negroes of a great majority of fine artists can boast the same kind of money that the white artists are privileged to make? And the answer is they couldn't. Outside of a Miles Davis or a John Coltrane, most black musicians didn't get paid as much as white jazz musicians. You could also you also have to realize that a lot of these white musicians, Dave Brubeck, Jerry Mulligan, Stan Getz had a big band that was pretty popular. Benny Goodman was historically a very famous figure, right? A lot of these people are playing Dave Brubeck, Jerry Mulligan, Stan Getz. They're playing cool jazz, West Coast Cool, and West Coast Cool is more popular than what the black musicians are playing. So is it not necessarily their fault that they're getting paid more? Their music is reaching a wider audience, is a little bit more popular. But then is it the music that's more popular, or is it the artist that's more popular? Is it because they're white? There's all kinds of layers to this onion here. Okay. In what other society can an artist be so flagrantly plagiarized, ignored, deprived, and still be cast as the heavy? Okay. Jazz is not the first time this happened or the last time this happened. Way back in minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was the most popular form of entertainment in the 19th century, and it lasted up until the late 19th century, but there were still remnants of it into the middle of the 20th century, and quite frankly, now some people still dress up in blackface or something similar, thinking it's funny for Halloween or something like that. White entertainers capitalizing on, in this case, a parody of African-American culture, but still using it as a vehicle for, profit. Ragtime, developed by an African American, developed in the African American community, particularly Scott Joplin and others, black piano players, capitalized later by Tin Pan Alley songwriters who were oftentimes white. Jazz, which again, this is the whole topic of what we're talking about. The very first group to record jazz, although, again, a Creole musician, Freddie Kephart, was first approached and said no. So the opportunity was there, but it was originally first recorded by a white band instead. Again, alternative history. What would we be having this conversation? What would the repercussions have been if a black band or a Creole band would have been the first group to record jazz? The Paul Whiteman Orchestra. Paul Whiteman was the king of jazz. He was white. His band played very little jazz, right? We just got done talking about the swing bands not too long ago. The popular swing bands, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Artie Shaw, a lot of those bands were white and they were not necessarily innovative. They were just playing a lot of pop tunes, but those bands were the most popular, therefore making the most money. Meanwhile, some of the black bands that were doing more interesting things were less popular or less financially secure. Okay, the whole bebop developed by black musicians, really innovative black musicians. The counter being West Coast cool, which became predominantly white and watered down. And now we're back at bebop, back to black ethnic music in a sense, right? This happened in other forms of popular music, rhythm and blues, which became, in many ways rock and roll. Pat Boone made a living out of covering black rock and roll and black rhythm and blues stars. If you want to have a good, insightful laugh, go look up. I won't post any of these things because it's not that important that you see them, but if you want to check them out, go to YouTube and just find Little Richard's Tutti Frutti. It's everybody knows Little Richard's Tutti Frutti. A wop babaloo bop, a wop bam boom, that song. And then watch Pat Boone. Pat Boone recorded the same song. It charted better than Little Richard's, and it's different. And that's what Pat Boone did. He was asked to cover African American songs, but put basically a white face on them. Elvis Presley got to start doing the same thing. Okay, in soul music is intrinsically linked with the black community of the early 60s and the civil rights fight. Yet there's a certain subset of soul called blue-eyed soul, which is white soul singers like the Righteous Brothers. Dusty Springfield was a British woman and had a great version of Son of a Preacher Man. Again, here we have white folks I wouldn't say taking advantage of or stealing, but using this opportunity. Funk, which is predominantly black pop music, James Brown, George Clinton and Parliament and Funkadelic, other pop funk groups like the Commodores or Kool and the Gang, Ohio Players. Again, it's very black. You had white funk groups like the Average White Band or Wild Cherry. And of course, hip hop. Hip hop came again out of the African American and Latin American communities in the Bronx in the 1970s, rose to fame in the 80s. But yet you would have white spin-offs. My personal one that I am actually quite fond of, I used to be a big Beastie Boys fan myself. You had guys like Vanilla Ice that had sort of one-hit wonders. Of course, thankfully, nowadays, those color lines, particularly in hip-hop, seem to be gone or are mostly gone, which is great to see. But early on in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, I remember I grew up at that time, and I remember how it was perceived as black music, if music at all. A lot of people said that's not music; they're not singing, right? And it was predominantly black. So when white artists did it, it was unusual. So this is nothing new. This happened and will continue to happen. You get some innovation that happens typically outside of the mainstream, and outside of the mainstream is oftentimes a minority. In this case, black is what we're talking about in jazz, but it happens with Latin music as well. And then it becomes part of the culture oftentimes when white artists bridge the gap, and they do it oftentimes not as well, but that opens up the music to a wider audience. Okay. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is this little bit about the anti-festival. So you have some pretty outspoken people like Charles Mingus and Max Roach. The Newport Jazz Festival it's still there in Newport, Rhode Island. It's famously a jazz festival that they put on every year. But Max Roach and Charles Mingus and others were protesting the fact that white jazz musicians were getting paid more than the black innovative musicians at the Newport Jazz Festival. And again, the white musicians' music was more popular. So, all of this is relative, right? So instead of playing at the festival that in 1960, Mingus and Roach actually organized what they called an anti-festival, which they set up at a hotel, the Cliff Walk Manor Hotel, just a few blocks down. And they slept out in like tents and stuff, and they made their own stage. And they played music that was more, again, for the new innovators, the more challenging music, the more socially outspoken music and stuff like that. And it is from this that Candid Records was founded. And Candid Records released the Freedom Now Suite by Max Roach. Candid Record released Charles Mingus's original Faba's Fables. Candid Record actually released an album of music recorded at the Anti-Festival and other things like that. They did more challenging things. So these racial things won't go away. We are now, at least historically, at a point where we are crossing the threshold, and soon, at least legally, it will not be an issue, civil rights. But that doesn't mean it won't have its effect on the music. We are going to backtrack a little bit, or another type of jazz that comes up in the 50s and the 60s is a type of jazz called free jazz, which is much more experimental and challenging, but we're going to save that for after the test. So with that in mind, this is actually where we stop for test 2. So test 2, again, the tests are not cumulative. So test 2 is going to incorporate stuff that happened after the swing era. So that starts with bebop through hard bop. So this second test will be bebop, cool, third stream, modal, and hard bop. Those 5 styles. The artists we covered in those 5 styles, the film clips you watched over those 5 styles, the lectures and the notes from those 5 styles. That will be your second exam. And I will obviously let you know when that's going to happen through Moodle and those sorts of things. All right. Thank you all very much for your time. Have a lovely afternoon. You're doing great. Almost done. Until next time. Bye-bye.